Ask what were they doing? What was going on in the Americas in that time? And again, a need for archaeologists to be more humble. How much have they really looked at? Take the Mississippi Valley civilization, which plays an important role in this book. The famous sites are sites like Cahokia or Poverty Point or the Ohio sites such as High Bank and Newark. Amazing, huge geometrical earthworks, absolutely stunning. But the trouble is that in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, there was massive, large-scale destruction of these ancient monuments. They were not considered to be worth preserving. The needs of agriculture and industry were more important. So what we can say is that round about 90% of the monuments that were in the Mississippi Valley in, say, 1700 are gone now. They're not there. So archaeologists, in drawing their conclusions about that culture, are drawing it on a tiny fraction that's randomly left by chance from the mass-scale wipeout that was caused. And then when the archaeologists come to it with preconceived ideas about what sort of culture it should be, that's another form of censorship that imposes itself upon the past. We should let the past speak for itself.
And was that just human destruction without people thinking about it? Why would
Well, I mean, first of all, there was the view. Things have changed. We live in a different world today. But America in the 18th and 19th centuries was in an aggressively expansionist, expanding westward, and that involved taking the land of the indigenous inhabitants. Well, if you're going to take away, tens of millions of acres from people and stuff them somewhere else, then you need a good excuse to do so. So what you do is you depict them as savages, and you say that actually we're doing them a favor. There's a quote I put in the book concerning the horrific project called the boarding schools project in America, where Native American children, about 90% of them, were physically removed from their families and stuck in boarding schools in another state far away, punished if they wore any traditional clothing, given the whole ideology of Western civilization, and encouraged to cut themselves off from their roots. Well, no wonder we're a species with amnesia if we take the entire cultural memory banks of the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas and deliberately wipe them out.
And so what are some of the things that we're going to learn from reading this book? What are some of the new insights about both North and South America that we might have just previously assumed what I did? There's not much happening there, not much we can learn.
Yes. Well, there's a whole range of things, actually. The first and most important issue to understand, and I've really done a great deal of work on this, is that North America was at the epicenter of a humongous global cataclysm. And it was particularly bad because it was a comet. The evidence is really compelling on this. Now, there are people who are proposing alternatives. One thing nobody disagrees on anymore is that there was a cataclysm 12,800 years ago. The best case, as far as I'm concerned, is the comet case, and we have a group of more than 60 leading scientists who are making that case very, very strongly in the pages of all the mainstream journals. But we have to consider the nature of that cataclysm. It was very, very odd. At that time, North America had been, and the world actually, had been emerging from the Ice Age for several thousand years. The world had been getting warmer. The ice sheets had been getting shallower. If they were, let's say, 2 miles deep at 21,000 years ago, they were about a mile deep or less by 12,800 years ago. So the world was warming up. And then something radical happens. You get a massive deep freeze that descends on the planet. So the planet goes back into the coldest of the Ice Age, suddenly, literally overnight. And you get at the same time this massive die-off of animal species, and very weirdly, you get a rise in sea level. Now, normally, in an episode of freezing, you would not expect the sea level to rise. What you'd expect that extra water to do is to reform as ice on the existing continental ice caps, but it doesn't. You get a sudden spike, a very rapid spike in sea level right at the beginning of this event. That's very, very puzzling. But what can explain it perfectly, is the impact of several fragments of a disintegrated comet with the North American ice cap. The heat and the shock generated by those impacts releases enormous floods of meltwater, which go where? They pour primarily into the Atlantic Ocean, and there they stop the Gulf Stream in its tracks. The Gulf Stream is part of the central heating system of our planet. It keeps the planet warm. It's part of a global meridional oceanic circulation that goes on, taking warm water from the tropics, bringing it up to the north, putting it down, bringing it round again. It stopped completely for about 1,200 years at the beginning of this episode, and that was caused by that release of meltwater, which is measured in the sea level rise that we. Recently, just recently, there's been news of the discovery of a very large crater in Greenland, actually 32 kilometers wide. It's been discovered with remote sensing. And actually, a lot of the evidence for the cataclysmic event that took place 12,800 years ago does come from Greenland. Why? Because they have had permanent ice cover in Greenland for hundreds of thousands of years, right through to today. So they're able to put down big tubular drills deep into the ice and bring up a core which has different chemical elements at different levels. And from that, they can tell what the climate was in the world at that time. And more than that, they can tell, for example, were wildfires burning? Was there a huge amount of, they call it biomass burning going on? That leaves specific chemical signatures in those ice cores in Greenland. The biomass is not burning in Greenland, it's actually burning in North America, but it's carried by the winds. The smoke and the soot are carried by the winds to Greenland and show up there. So we have this discovery of a very large crater in Greenland. We've already had from the ice cores evidence that are called impact proxies. For example, platinum, iridium, melt glass, nanodiamonds. They're caused by the heat and shock of an impact. But now we have a 32-kilometer wide crater in Greenland. The scientists who are working on this regard this as a global event. There's evidence of impacts as far south as Antarctica, as far north as Greenland, as far east as Syria, and right the way across the Pacific Ocean as well. It's a global cataclysm, but the heart of it was North America, and the North American ice cap, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran ice caps were joined to the Greenland ice cap. They were all one thing. So this is, to my mind, is likely to prove to be further evidence of the cosmic nature of this cataclysm that occurred 12,800 years ago. And it's on a scale that, were it to repeat in our world today, which actually is not impossible, because the remnants of the original giant comet are still in orbit, and they form a known meteor stream called the Taurid meteor stream, through which we pass twice a year. If we were to have another event like the event that happened 12,800 years ago, I can say with absolute confidence that our civilization would not survive it. It would not survive it. All these great buildings, all this amazing machinery, all this tech, none of it would stand us in good stead. We would be gone as a civilization. It would become a punctuation mark in the human story. And when I look at that scenario, bearing in mind that we do pass through the Taurid meteor stream twice every year, for 12 days in June and for 12 days in November, we pass through it. When I look at that situation, I ask myself, who in the planet today would survive a disaster on that scale? What kind of people would survive it? And I know it wouldn't be me. I know it wouldn't be the majority of urbanites, or indeed scientists, or any of the creations of the modern world. The people who are really fit for survival in a world in turmoil are the hunter-gatherers. They're the meek of the earth, in Namibia, in the Amazon jungle. People whose daily business is survival. They would hardly be knocked sideways by this event. They would just take it in their stride. and they would carry on. They would not suffer the psychological damage. Can you imagine the psychological damage of billions of people who are used to living in the comfort of cities, with every necessity laid on for them every day, without any difficulty in acquiring it? Suddenly all that stops. Can you imagine the effect of that on the educated Western mind? It would be extremely bad. But the hunter-gatherers would survive. I think that actually was the case 12,800 years ago as well. Really? I think it was the hunter-gatherers who survived and passed on the message. So one part of it is and I've tried to really bring this home, how central America was to this cataclysmic event that took place across the whole world, and then consider what did that obliterate? What did that event obliterate? What did it wipe out from the human story?
Is this the lost civilization? Because you've always talked about this.
You see, when you're looking for a lost civilization, and I mean a civilization, something that we would recognize as a civilization, I'll tell you directly, I don't think they flew to the moon, and I don't think they had airplanes. But I think that we're talking about a civilization more than 12,000 years ago, which was as advanced as our civilization was, say, in the late 18th century or early 19th century. In other words, they could navigate the world. They could explore the world. They could measure the Earth accurately. They had precise astronomy. They could create beautiful maps that were accurate in terms of latitude and longitude. That kind of level of civilization. I think that's what was sitting there. Now you need a place where such a civilization can evolve, and you need to explain why archaeology hasn't found it yet. And I've considered many possibilities over the years. Back in 1995 with Fingerprints of the Gods, Antarctica looked very interesting to me. Later I became very interested in what's called the Sunda Shelf, which is the area of land around what's now the Malaysian Peninsula and the Indonesian islands out to the Philippines. That was a continent-sized landmass that was above water during the Ice Age and is underwater now. Very interesting to look there and see what's going on there. But one place that nobody ever looked, precisely because of the ideology, precisely because of what we've been taught about the Americas, was the Americas. Nobody looked there. It was not considered worth looking there. And I think that's a huge mistake, because the Americas stand out as a candidate with this amazing richness of resources. And then the second thing, because of the character of the Ice Age, there were long periods when the Americas were cut off from the rest of the world, cut off from the conflicts and the difficulties going on in the so-called Old World. What a beautiful and amazing place for a civilization to evolve, a civilization that was separate, that was different, that had its own way of doing things. That is one of the reasons why I think we need to take America very, very seriously, because we now know that the archaeological story we've been taught about the Americas is complete and utter bullshit from beginning to end. Clovis was not first. Clovis was a latecomer to the Americas. We know that archaeology has not had its eye on the ball because of Clovis. They've not been considering the pre-Clovis ages. It's only now that they're beginning to look at what happened before Clovis. So they've just closed their eyes to all of those possibilities. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the massive destruction that took place in the Mississippi Valley and across the Americas of Native American culture and of Native American memories. So we're left with this puzzling series of mysteries which need to be explained. And as I go through the research, I find certain things ringing bells with me. I'm working in the Mississippi Valley. I'm at Moundville in Alabama. And I'm looking at a notice board. It's just the beginning of my research into this interesting culture in the Mississippi Valley. And the notice board has been put up by the site, and they're telling us about the site. And what they say is that the whole site was about afterlife beliefs, and that it was believed that on death, the soul of the deceased would ascend to the constellation of Orion, and then would pass through the constellation of Orion to the Milky Way, and then would make a journey along the Milky Way, where it would face trials and tribulations and be judged on its behavior during life. The weird thing is, that's exactly the ancient Egyptian system of religion. It's exactly the system. It's too detailed to be a coincidence. What is that narrow star shaft in the Great Pyramid doing, if not pointing at the lowest of the three stars of Orion's belt? To send the soul of the deceased up to Orion, then indeed a journey along the Milky Way, trials and tribulations, and a judgment. The same story exactly. But how do we explain that? How can it be a coincidence? No, I don't think so. Details are far too complicated. So what's the answer to this? Could ancient Egypt have directly influenced the Mississippi Valley? Well, no, actually, because ancient Egypt has ceased to exist as a civilization by the time that many of the Mississippi Valley sites rose to prominence. Couldn't have happened then. The conclusion I come to is that what we're looking at in both areas, in ancient Egypt and in the Mississippi Valley, is a legacy of ideas from a remote common source, which actually influenced cultures all around the world. And it's why we find these astonishing similarities. I think a deliberate effort was made by the survivors of that cataclysm, those who came from the lost civilization. A deliberate effort was made by them to try to restart their civilization. And they used the hunter-gatherers with whom they coexisted in the world at that time as their seedbed to try to plant and re-establish these ideas. And that's why we find the same ideas cropping up all around the world in cultures that definitely were not in contact with one another. And trying to explain it by direct contact doesn't work. What does work is going far back, 12,000 plus years back, going right back to that time when these ideas were seeded all around the world.